Next are two speakers who shouldn't be a surprise this year because it's not an any day Washington conference without Charlie Cook and Amy Walter. Each year, Charlie lives up to his reputation as Washington's most trusted and quoted political analyst. He's been a popular election night voice every national election since 1990, a pundit's pundit, and a skilled editor and publisher. Amy Walter is simply one of the best political journalists in D.C. She's the national editor of the Cook Political Report, where she analyzes trends that shape the political environment. Charlie and Amy, everyone hesitates to deliver any predictions about this year, but you two are the best at it. So let's get started.
Hello, I'm Amy Walter with the Cook Political Report. Glad to be with you virtually as it is, and I'm sorry not to be there in person. This is one of our favorite events to come and speak to in the fall of every year. Just going to give a pretty quick but broad overview of where we sit now, so close to the election, about 6 weeks away from the election. And my colleague Charlie Cook is going to give his perspective, and we're going to leave time here at the end for questions. So look forward to being able to really dig into some of the specifics after our speeches. Look, what's fascinating about this moment that we're in, and in fact, the last 4 years, quite frankly, has been the fact that we've had these two incredible forces that are seemingly contradictory, that are playing equal and important roles. One is this incredible amount of change, tumult, seeming chaos. Every minute, it feels like once in a lifetime events are occurring. And at the same time, politically, we've had incredible consistency and stability. Opinions about this president, opinions about this race, opinions about Joe Biden have not budged all that much in the last year. And for the president, of course, for the last 4 years. We've seen a president who has opinions that really, from the very beginning, opinions of him have been pretty well hardened. The good news for the president is in bad times, he has shown to have a pretty steady floor. In other words, he has supporters who just don't abandon him when things are going south. The lowest approval rating he's gotten at this point in his presidency is around 38, 39%. That's much better than some previous presidents have seen at their lowest moments. The bad news for this president, though, is that he has a pretty low ceiling. Even when things are going really well, say at the end of 2019, the economy is looking good, consumer confidence is high, he's not able to break above 48, 49%. In fact, he's the first president in modern political history not to crack into the 50% approval rating in the Gallup polling. So this narrow range has defined the president for 4 years, and it's now defining this race as well. If you think about where we started, let's just think about just this year, right? We started in 2020, a president with an approval rating somewhere around 42, 43%. We went immediately into impeachment. Not long after impeachment, the coronavirus hits. We go into an economic lockdown, which creates an economic catastrophe and slowdown, shutdown. We have protests in the streets at record levels, the kinds of protests we haven't seen in more than 50 years around police violence and racial equity. Many of the protests in cities like Portland and Seattle, then Kenosha, turned violent. And now we have the death of a Supreme Court justice right before an election, and what is going to be a bruising fight to replace that justice right before an election. The president's approval rating, after all of this, today is 43%. The race for president in the beginning of January, NBC Wall Street Journal poll, Donald Trump trailing Joe Biden, 50% for Biden, 44% for Trump. This last weekend, the NBC Wall Street Journal poll comes out and it's 51 Biden, 43 Trump. All of that happened. And it feels like the race has and it not just feels like, the race has stayed completely static. If you had been in a cave for these last 8 months and all you saw were those numbers that I gave you, you would have thought that it's been a pretty calm and peaceful last 8 months with not a lot happening. Some of this sort of the staticness, the lack of change in opinions of the president, some of that is not about the president. It's about the world that we live in right now, a world that has become increasingly polarized. It was so before Donald Trump. In fact, the trading range for Barack Obama, once his honeymoon period where he was first elected, those first 8-9 months of his presidency, once that honeymoon was over, he stayed within that pretty narrow range as well. Even after the killing of Osama bin Laden, his approval rating did not budge all that much. So big events we saw didn't move Barack Obama's ratings all that much, not having much of an impact on Donald Trump. But it's a bigger problem for Donald Trump in the following ways. As I said, he's never been able to really hit that 50% approval rating threshold. And he spent his entire presidency with more people disapproving than approving of what he's doing. And that was when things were going well. Now we're in the middle of a pandemic. Now we're in the middle of an economic downturn. It's harder to see how we can turn those numbers around. Of course, we're also so close to the election. Turning those numbers around seem to be all but impossible now. You put on top of that a country that is feeling much more pessimistic today than they were a year ago about the direction of the way things are going in this country. About 2/3 of Americans think that things are off on the wrong track. It's been as high as 75%. It's unclear where it will be as we get into October, but I don't know if people are going to be feeling particularly optimistic considering the fact that we still have a health crisis, an economic crisis. Neither look like they are going to be solved in the immediate future. This president, as I said, is still trailing Joe Biden by a significant amount. In the Wall Street Journal poll, it's 6 points. The average right now, he's behind by close to 7 points. We've never had a president in history with numbers that look like this, the low approval ratings, the high percent of voters saying things are off on the wrong track, being behind by his opponent by this significant of a margin, this close to the election. Never had a president come back and win re-election with these sort of numbers. And yet, with this president, nobody feels comfortable saying, but that's right. History is just going to follow traditional historical norms because this president is outside of the historical norm. This is a president who seems to defy political gravity all the time. Just when things look the most dire for him, somehow he survives. And why shouldn't we think that he will do so once again? Remember 2016, for example, Hillary Clinton looked pretty good until she didn't in terms of winning the election. I think the most important thing to remember, though, about this election, besides the fact that it's no longer 2016, the president's now the incumbent, not a challenger. So he's being graded on a different curve than he was when he was the outsider, is who his opponent is. In fact, I would argue that of all the things that have happened between January and today, one of the most important in terms of the impact on this race was Democrats choosing Joe Biden as the nominee instead of Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren. In January, it didn't look like a given that Joe Biden was going to win this thing. In fact, looked like he was probably going to lose it and Bernie Sanders was going to win it. And you could already see the roadmap that Republicans were laying out for what that would mean for them, not just for the Trump campaign, but for candidates further down on the ballot, Senate candidates, House candidates, heck, even legislative candidates. We're going to run on a contrast, right? Here's who Republicans are. We stand for mom and apple pie and flags and capitalism, and Democrats stand for socialism, and we're going to look like Venezuela in a couple of years. It's disastrous. If Donald Trump can't change opinions of himself, well, at least he could make the race a referendum on the other person. And he did that really well in 2016. Anytime the race in 2016 focused on Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump's numbers improved. Anytime the race was focused on Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton's position improved. This year, Joe Biden is just not in that same category as Hillary Clinton. He has decent favorable ratings. The last Wall Street Journal NBC poll found his favorable ratings just a little bit underwater, about -2%. But that's compared to Hillary Clinton, who was 10 points unfavorable, seen unfavorably by 10 points at this point in 2016. In some of these battleground states, the intensity of dislike for her was off the charts. Joe Biden he may not be loved. He's not like the most loved candidate ever to run for president, but he does not engender that same level of vitriol that Hillary Clinton did. And again, this close to an election, it's hard to see how that's going to change. And the Trump campaign has tried every angle they can to bring those numbers down closer to where the Hillary Clinton number was, or to try to make him into a Bernie Sanders. And it just hasn't worked. The only person I think who could really bring Joe Biden's numbers down would be Joe Biden. And the first chance we will see Joe Biden really the first opportunity we get to see him go one-on-one with Donald Trump is on September 29th in their first debate. Now, debates traditionally, presidential debates have not, at least in these last 10 or 20 years, haven't had much impact on the final outcome. And I kind of think that's the way things are this year too. When you look back at where voters were sitting in terms of their vote in 2016, at this point, nationally, about 17% of voters said they were undecided or thinking about voting for a third-party candidate. There were a lot of people out there who were super unhappy that they had these two choices in front of them, that both of them they thought were terrible. And they were looking at third-party candidates. This year, only 6% of voters nationally say that they're undecided on average. That means that there are fewer people that are up for grabs. Most people now have really dug in to their candidate. There aren't third-party candidates who are attracting attention or support. My son, who's 13, is obsessed with the idea of Kanye being president. That's not going to happen. He's not made many ballots either. So there's just very little room for much volatility in this race. And opinions about Joe Biden could be shaped by a disastrous debate performance. But at the same time, it's still hard for this race to move away from where it is right now, which is a complete and utter referendum on one person, and that's Donald Trump. The other challenge Trump has in making this race a referendum on Biden or on Democrats or on anything other than himself and his handling of the presidency is that he loves the spotlight. I mean, we've always known that about him. He has a very hard time letting go of it. And if you're going to make the other person the focus, if you're going to have like a sustained overarching campaign against someone, you gotta give up your place in front of the camera and let it move over to them. So even if or when Joe Biden does have a mess up, will Trump be able to get himself out of the shot and let the attention focus on Joe Biden? Thus far, that hasn't really been the case. Before I turn it over to Charlie, I want to talk about just two things that I think are the most unknowable and most unpredictable about this race. As I said, everything else up until this point has been incredibly stable. The one big question mark for all of us is what voting is actually going to look like in November, or actually even before then. We know a number of states have already started with their early vote. Many voters have already received absentee ballots in the mail. States are expecting record number of absentee ballots to be not just requested, but turned in. And what we know too is that the kinds of people who say they are voting in person are different from the people who say that they're going to vote by mail. Again, everything in this country has been polarized. The president helps to drive that polarization. He thrives in creating these divisions. And what that has meant, for, again, the president, as we know, saying over and over again, he thinks vote by mail is corrupt and can be rigged, that Republicans are mostly saying they're going to vote in person. Democrats say that they're going to vote early or vote by mail. Why that matters, especially in states where they don't have much of a tradition of vote by mail, is that there could be some problems. Again, not nefarious, not that people are trying to literally mess with the system, but just that mistakes happen. The one state I think that is going to get a tremendous amount of attention and should, and it could have a big impact on this race, ultimately on the presidential race, is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a state that doesn't do a lot of vote by mail. Only about 5 or 10% turned in ballots by mail or absentee in the last election. It is a state that just doesn't have the infrastructure to handle huge influx of mail ballots. It took a long time for the city of Philadelphia and the suburbs to get through all of the vote by mail ballots in the spring primary. But the bigger problem is that voters aren't necessarily educated in how to fill out these ballots either. And something just as simple as how you put an envelope in and sign in an envelope to be sent to the election official can make the difference between your vote counting and not counting. There's literally a secrecy envelope that you have to put the envelope that you've signed into and then send that in. It seems like one of those little things that, you know, it's sort of a vestige of a long ago time. But the point is, and the problem with this is, the courts have ruled that if that ballot is put in the wrong envelope or an incorrect way, that ballot doesn't count. And they don't have to tell you that your ballot didn't count. So a lot of people could be sending in incorrectly, not purposefully, but just incorrectly, their ballot, and it gets thrown out. Now, could that make the difference in a tight race? Yes. Is it going to be necessarily the thing that makes or breaks the presidency? I don't know. But it's definitely one of these things that puts a big question mark in many, just in terms of what election night could look like and what the final tally could look like. The polls are telling us one thing, but how people are actually going about voting is very important. And you know, that leads us to the other question. If this race ends up close, and quite frankly, what we're looking at right now is a battleground, electoral college battleground, that is pretty vast and also pretty narrow. We can see a situation where the race does, it is close enough. Biden has a lead that's big enough to get the 270 electoral votes, but it's not a washout. We could also see a situation where the very closest races, even those that today, you know, we think of as still somewhat Republican leaning or red, places like Georgia or Iowa, end up flipping to Joe Biden, and it's a washout. But as I said, the actual physical counting of the ballots is going to be an important piece of this. And if indeed we are on the first section, where it takes a little bit longer to count the ballots, the race is close, Biden is leading, but we still have to make sure that all the ballots have been counted. There could be a window of time between election night and when the election is called where we don't know who the president is, where we don't know control of the Senate. And what I worry about is in that vacuum of time, you have the vacuum filled by nefarious agents. Some of them will be outside agitators, Russians, etc. Some are going to be coming from people who believe that there are conspiracies being committed. All of it will be thrown into what we know as social media. And that can also translate into real life. If people are so convinced that what they're reading on their Facebook feed and what they're seeing on cable television is real, and they take that and go out into the streets, that to me is the danger for which I hoping will not come to pass, but which we should be prepared to at least pay attention to. We should at least have that that we should be prepared for that possibility. I'm hoping that we're wrong. I'm hoping that I'm over prepared for this, and that this runs like a typical smooth contest. We go through a regular election night. Yes, states are still counting ballots into the 2, 3, 4 days after the election, but it doesn't turn into anything dramatic. I hope that is the case, but I do think it's important to be prepared for the unpredictable. And in this case, that to me is the biggest unpredictable variable. So with that, Charlie, I'm going to hand it over to you, and then we'll hand it over for some questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I think we should have had those electronic sets with the Capitol Hilton ballroom, just so that we would feel at home where this event normally is. I thought I'd just start right where Amy left off, that we're talking about human nature, human behavior in the future. Things always happen. And then with the coronavirus, this is obviously, the phrase that we hear over and over again is an election like no other, which is absolutely true. And there is a lot of potential. There are a lot of moving parts here, things that go wrong, polling places not open because they couldn't get enough poll workers there who tend to be retirees to man the polling places, or polling places not open because they're in a senior center or something else that's just simply not open. People another wave hitting a local area and people feeling uncomfortable to go out and vote in person. And as Amy said, there's different, 50 state election laws, and each one is different from those that have 100% already vote by mail and have for years, all the way to like a Pennsylvania that has done everything they could, or Texas actually has done everything they could to make it, almost impossible or extremely difficult to vote by mail. So lots of different things. And there are just so many things that can go wrong. But, in a way, I keep thinking back to Y2K, when we were going from December 31st, 1999 to January 1st of 2000 at the stroke of midnight. And there were people that were saying, the sky's going to fall. Everything, your toaster's not going to work. Everything's going to be. And when it happened, when we went from one millennium to another, not much happened. And the reason that not much happened is people thought about it and they prepared for it. And so I think that, yes, there are a lot, this is not going to be an election like any other, and there will be things that go wrong. But I think because there's an awareness of this, that some of these problems are likely to be mitigated. So I'm not, I think there's a lot of alarmists out there, and there's reason for concern, but this is not a last minute thing. Like, for example, Wisconsin had their primary back in April. And I think it was, there are 151 or so polling places in Milwaukee, and only like 5 or 6 were open, only 2 in the city of Green Bay. Well, the thing is, the coronavirus had just hit. There was no planning. There was no thought, ahead of time about something like that. Well, we've had a little bit more time, and I think I think things may be a little less disruptive than others. So let me just touch for a second on the presidential, and then focus on the Senate and the implications of the Senate. I think in my mind of like an hourglass, and the hourglass with the sand coming through it, and the sand represents time, time before the election is done. I mean, that nobody else can vote, period. But it's also available votes. Another one, available, how many votes are in the pool of potential that someone can get. And as people cast their ballots, how that sort of drains away, and there are fewer and fewer and fewer. And for President Trump, he was typically 4, 5, 6 points behind in most of the polling from the time Biden got in in April 25th of last year, all the way through May. Into the pandemic, things were, as Amy said, really, really steady. He had President Trump had a narrow trading range, and there wasn't a lot of change, but we did see a lot of change in the race, in the horse race, starting about the 1st of June. But I think it is important for us to remember that people tend to fight the last war, just like generals fight the last wars. I think people wage the last campaign. And too many people, I think, are looking at the 2020 election through a lens of 2016, when there's really not much in common here. In fact, I can think of 3 things that are in common. Number one, this is a U.S. presidential election, so they're both alike in that way. Number 2, Donald Trump is the Republican nominee in both of them. And number 3, both years began in a 2. But other than that, there's really not much of a resemblance there at all, because when you have a race with 2 non-incumbents running, it's a choice. People are choosing, and partisanship comes in, all that, but it's a fundamentally choice between 2 people. But when it's a referendum, it's a vote of confidence, no confidence. It's a vote on, do you want to extend this incumbent's contract for another 4 years, yes or no? And that's about 75, 80% of the equation. And that things don't, and that just dominates everything. And that the best predictor of how a president's going to do is their job approval rating. And it's interesting, just to use a Gallup, because they're the ones with the historic numbers that go back to World War II. But basically, every president that had a Gallup job approval rating going into election day of 50% or higher, every single one of them won. And everyone who had a job approval rating below 48% lost. In other words, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and if you want to throw in a non-elected, Gerald Ford. The one that was in that little zone right in the middle was George W. Bush. And his last Gallup was 48%. So he was sort of on the cusp. But if you remember Election Day 2004, for part of the day, there were a lot of people thinking that John Kerry had won. I mean, it was a very close race. Well, okay, where does President Trump fit into that? Well, let's see. His first year in office, from the day he took office until 1 year later, his average job approval rating in the Gallup poll was 38%. 38%. That was the lowest of any elected incumbent in post-World War II history. And you know who the second lowest was? Bill Clinton, who was 11 points higher at 49. So, wow, that's a really bad first year. Well, okay, what about the second year? Second year, his average approval, Gallup approval for the year went up 2 points to 40. And it was the lowest second year of any elected president in post-World War II history. So you think, oh, well, maybe it comes back on the third year. Well, the third year, it went up 2 more points to 42%. Now, it's not the lowest of any third year elected president in post-World War II history, because Jimmy Carter has slid down to 37%. But it's a heck of a lot lower than anybody that got reelected, and it's lower than one of the people that didn't get elected. So this is not this is like a flashing danger signal for an incumbent, that this is not where an incumbent wants to be going into a reelection. So, I mean, I think that the switch from 4 to 6 to right now, the of all the sort of credible national polls, the narrowest margin is Fox News at 5, Fox News and a Monmouth University at 7. Those are the two closest. Then you have a 3, 8, a 9, and Quinnipiac University, it's a good poll as well, has it at 10. Now, when you hear all these numbers, here's my advice. Use the Olympic scoring method. Throw out the high one, throw out the low one, and look at the rest, because you've probably just eliminated the outliers. And you look at that, and this is basically a 8-point race in sort of the live telephone interviews, the polls that I look at. So what took a race from 4 to 6 to 5 to 10, most likely 7, 8-ish? What happened? And I think it was two things. One, it was the economy, and two was the coronavirus, pretty obviously. But the economy was not in a way people thought. And I'm going to get to the Senate in just a second. Was not, I think, in the way people would normally guess. If someone told you that an incumbent president of the United States is up for re-election, and we go into a steep economic downturn, we tip into a recession in the election year, normally you'd say, oh, they're gone, because you can't. And particularly one that had very weak job approval ratings to begin with. You'd say, well, they can't win, because normally a president would be blamed for it. Well, that's not happening, because everyone knows that President Trump didn't create the coronavirus. He didn't allow it into the United States. He couldn't have stopped the economic downturn. The rest of the world got one too. That's not it. So it's not that he's encountering a headwind. But what happened was he lost his tailwind. The most compelling reason to reelect President Trump was the strong economy. And that was the thing that was boosting him forward. And the loss of that tailwind, I think it really, really cost. That's what allowed him to drop from 4, 5, 6 points down behind Biden, down into the 5 to 10, most likely 7 and 8. And that specifically, there were some people in the middle that thought the economy is great, and they gave President Trump 100% of the credit for the strong economy. But at the same time, they had some doubts, concerns, feelings about him as a person, about his honesty, his character, his leadership style, things like that. But as long as the economy was great, all these concerns about him as a person, his style, his manner, were kept in check, and those people were kept in the middle. But you lose that strong economy, and these concerns, I think, start going way up. So anyway, it's how I see it. Is there time to turn around? Yes. Are there 42 days for it to turn around? No, because as Amy said, voting already started. The ballots were mailed out in North Carolina 2 weeks ago. Early voting started in Virginia, where Amy lives, on Friday. That every day goes by, more and more people will have voted. I think we're going to have a record number of people will have voted before the first debate even occurs. The record number of people will have voted by the end of September. As we go, more and more that hourglass has been going further down. So real quick on the Senate. Beginning of this year, I think most people in my business thought more or less that there was about a 1 in 3 chance that Democrats had to win a majority in the Senate, because we knew that Democrats were going to lose 1 seat in Alabama. As you know, it's 53-47, 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats. So Democrats would need a 3-seat net gain to get a majority if Biden-Harris wins and Harris was able to break a tie, or 4 seats if they didn't. But we knew they were going to lose a seat in Alabama. So that shifts it back 1. So there were but for Democrats to win a majority in the Senate at the beginning of this year, you'd say that they had to run the table. They had to win all 4 of the races that seemed plausible. They had to beat Martha McSally in Arizona. They had to beat Cory Gardner in Colorado. They had to beat Susan Collins in Maine. And they had to beat Tom Tillis in North Carolina. Now, we've seen parties run the table before, but that's really, really hard and was fairly unlikely. But what's happened since then? Each of these 4 are in considerably more danger now than they were back in January. And the ranks of those four have been added by three more Republican incumbents, like Joni Ernst in Iowa, where she's facing a very, very, very tough race, was 3 points behind in the Des Moines Register poll that came out a couple of days ago. In fact, actually, it's two Des Moines Register polls in a row where Ernst has been behind. Montana, extremely close race between the incumbent Steve Bullock and the Democratic governor Steve Daines, the incumbent, and Steve Bullock, the governor. That was a toss-up race. And then one more toss-up in Georgia with Senator David Perdue. And it's not that Purdue's done anything wrong, but kind of like Gardner in Colorado, the state's just changing out from under him. And that's a race that's effectively dead even, maybe Perdue up by one. And then several others that are just sort of right behind there. For example, South Carolina, Lindsey Graham's lead is minuscule, which is amazing in such a red conservative Republican state, but he's in deep trouble. Democrats are kind of barking at some other places, an open seat in Kansas, where that could be getting kind of interesting. There's some high profile races like against Mitch McConnell. McConnell's not going to lose, but there's a lot of money getting sucked in there. But anyway, they're basically multiple paths to 50, 51 seats for Democrats. And since they do look more likely than not, much more likely than not, to win the presidential, then they only need a net gain. They only need to get to 50, not to 51. But so this is the implications are obviously great. I mean, that if Democrats, it's virtually certain they're going to hold on to the House. I would put the Senate, I think it's basically close to 60-40. Between 50, it's higher than 50-50 chance for Democrats, and somewhere between there and 60-40, I think. And keep in mind, there's a tendency with Senate races where the close ones tend to break in the same direction, and that fewer people are ticket splitting now than ever before. And these Senate races are not in the same kind of states where most of the Senate races were in 2018, where they were in red Republican states. These are in purple states that, by and large, President Trump is not very popular. So I would put it somewhere between 51% and 60-40 that the Senate flips, and the presidential. I'm trying to think whether to give Amy credit for this or not. Amy was talking to a pollster a couple of weeks ago, and she was telling me about it afterwards, and said, what do you think? And the pollster said, you know what, I think there's correct me if I'm wrong, Amy, said there's a 20% chance that President Trump wins the Electoral College, and a 40% chance that Biden wins the Electoral College narrowly, and a 40% chance that Biden wins the Electoral College by more than a narrow margin. And the more I thought about it, and the more I look at the Electoral College, the more I look at the polling, the more I look at the calendar, that hourglass coming down, I think those numbers are about right. The 20% chance that President Trump does get 270, that he threads the needle, that would probably look a lot like 2016 did, with Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania winning by tiny margins. And so 20. Now, I mean, I think deep down, I don't think it's actually 20, but just to be safe, I'm gonna put there. And a 40% chance that it's a skinny Biden win. In other words, a skinny Biden would be, he wins the 3 states that Hillary Clinton lost by 0.7 of a percentage point or less. He holds on to the 20 states that Clinton won, plus DC. He wins the 3 states where Clinton lost by 0.7 of a percentage point or less. And he may or may not pick up Arizona as well, because in all 4 of those, he's got a pretty good lead, a pretty steady lead. And a big Biden win is more than that. It's where the next 2 of the big battleground states, where Florida and or North Carolina go, and maybe 4 from that next tier out, the Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, Texas, that are all extremely close races right now. So this is one where the chances of Democrats hitting a trifecta, they're better than 50-50. They are. And that is, from a policy standpoint, huge. And we'll have a lot to talk about next year. And the question would be, if Democrats win all 3, do they do what they did in 1993 and 4 after Bill Clinton was elected and Democrats had all 3, and in 2009 and 10 after Barack Obama was elected and Democrats had all 3, and to be fair, what Republicans did in 2017 and 18, when Republicans already had the House and Senate, and Donald Trump won, do they do a Thelma and Louise and just drive off the cliff, the ideological cliff, or is there truth in adult education and people learning from past experience and saying, you know what, maybe we shouldn't do the same thing that didn't work for parties the last 3 times that this situation occurred. So there'll be a lot to talk about. So let me turn it back to Peter, and or if Amy, I don't know if you wanted to have a rebuttal or at all, but let me turn it back.
Doesn't sound like there's much to rebut. But at any rate, you're right. 4 years ago, we were at the Capitol Hilton, and the forecasting was very different 4 years ago. I'm curious, given the results of 4 years ago, how does that affect how you analyze these races and make forecasts?
Why don't you go first, Charlie? I'm going to let
Sure.
start, and
I think there were a couple of things wrong, but they're not necessarily the same things that most people think. Most people think, well, the polls were all wrong. And what I ask them is, wait, which polls are you talking about? And they said, well, the national polls all said that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And actually, the national polls didn't say that. The national polls average for her going into election day was Hillary Clinton up by 3.2 percentage points. And on election day, what happened? She won the national popular vote by 2.1 percentage points. So they were 1.1 points off. And when pollsters went back and looked at who they interviewed and who actually voted, and they found the off was that non-college whites were very slightly underrepresented in the samples. College-educated whites were slightly oversampled. Now, Donald Trump won all kinds of people and people with probably double PhDs, but his strongest group was whites, non-college. That was his core demographic. And whites with college degree was a group where he ran way behind what Republicans normally do. When pollsters corrected for that in 2018, the polls were absolutely fine. Back in 2016, the state polling, I look back at our ratings, and we look at state polls and national, we take it all in. We had, going into election day, 45 states we had rated as lean likely solid Republican that went Republican, or lean likely solid Democrat that went Democratic. We had 2 states that we called toss-ups, Florida and North Carolina. And, Florida's kind of a perennial. Obama won by 1 point. Trump won by 1 point. The governor's race, Senate race went by 1 point each in 2018. So they were the toss-ups. But where we were wrong and where the polls were wrong, it was 3 offs: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And 2 things were key. One was those are 3 states with disproportionately large numbers of non-college whites. And from the exit polls, and Amy alluded to this, where we know that the late deciders in that election, the people that decide in the last few days, the people that decide in the last week before the election, went overwhelmingly towards Trump. Well, these were 3 states that had 3 of the most restrictive states in terms of voting early. And so they had extremely high percentages of people that just voted on election day. And that's when the vote was going on. But this shy Trump voter, to be honest, I don't know a single credible pollster that really believes that that's real. And in fact, if it were real, then why was there that same off in states where Trump was winning by a huge margin, and why would I be shy about admitting I'm voting for Trump? All my neighbors are as well. I think that's kind of a rationalization. So, but anyway, so I think, the last thing is that, this is an incumbent race. It's a referendum on President Trump, and the Democrats represent the status quo then. The Democrats had the White House for 8 consecutive years, and going in, we knew that when one party's had the White House for 8 consecutive years, that it happened 6 times in the post-war era, and that party had lost it 5 out of 6. I think we underestimated that. And next time it happens, well, remember that it's 6 out of 7 now. So there were lots of things that were very, very, very different. But to be honest, I think if you study 2016 enough, you can kind of get over the PTSD from 2016 and look at this clinically and say, I think we have a, I think we're, I think we have a pretty good idea what's going to happen here, barring a black swan event.
Yep.
So, you know, a lot of people thought, as you mentioned, that the economy would play a key role in the race. One of the factors you really didn't touch on earlier, which is kind of the surprise, and that's the vacant Supreme Court seat that has now materialized. Which candidate do you think gets an advantage during the process that's going to lead up to filling that seat?
Yeah, so I can take this one. As I said at the very beginning, you know, what's been remarkable about this last year is these seemingly once in a lifetime moments that in any other era would have impacted a political race, or the political standing of the incumbent seemed to just not make much of an impact at all. And I think that this fight for the Supreme Court fits into that same category. Supreme Court's an issue that certainly motivates partisans, although at this stage, when we have record enthusiasm, I mean, we are hitting levels we haven't seen certainly in at least the last 12 years, if not the last 25 years of intensity and motivation to vote. We had record turnout in 2018. I expect we'll see record turnout in 2020. So I don't think either side needed something to like juice their base, right? These people are motivated no matter what to come out and vote. The question then you have to ask is, what is this event going to do to those voters right now who Joe Biden is winning that either Donald Trump needs or Donald Trump had in the last election, but he doesn't have now, or who, you know, could be the deciders in this election? Independent voters, for example, voters who are not paying as much attention to this election, the kinds of voters that Donald Trump has been lagging with even since he's been elected, suburban voters, white women, college educated voters, specifically in those suburbs, white women, non-college voters who voted for Trump in the last election. Is a fight over a Supreme Court race going to bring those people back over to Donald Trump's camp? And I don't think that it will, given how this fight is at least right now being framed. If the fight is framed in the way it is right now on the Republican side, which is, this is glorious opportunity for us to cement a conservative majority for time immemorial on the Supreme Court, it's going to fulfill Trump's promises that he made in the campaign and has been able to follow through on judiciary, changing the face of judiciary. Again, that's going to get the base fired up, but little else. If Democrats stay where they are right now, and it seems where Biden is right now, which is framing this instead about a fight on healthcare, a fight on the future of healthcare, and specifically the fight on pre-existing conditions. We know that Supreme Court is taking up the constitutionality of the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act in November. I think that benefits actually Democrats because it targets those exact voters I just talked about, independents, women, suburban voters. These are the kinds of voters that Democrats were very successful with in 2018 on a message of healthcare. And so, if anything, I don't know, it's not going to do anything, I think, to just juice up a bases of either side that are already excited. And if Democrats keep focused on the issue of healthcare, they don't make this a race, which I've seen some Democrats and liberals don't make it a fight over, well, if you do this, Republicans, we're going to come back and retaliate next time. We're going to increase the size of the court. We're going to get rid of the filibuster when we're in charge. We're going to punish you. I think Democrats will be much more successful in framing this argument.
And I think I agree with Amy that I don't think, I mean, to me, both parties' bases are at DEFCON 1, the highest possible alert status, most pumped up. So, you know, unless somebody starts voting twice, once your maximum level of intensity, there's not, you know, maybe you vote earlier, or, but I don't think it'll change things. But I think, you know, I think Senator Romney's decision to support the confirmation before the election, you know, that makes it extremely likely that this will go through. It certainly won't hurt Democratic enthusiasm, but I don't think it's going to have as great an impact. And I think Amy's exactly right that to focus on the Supreme Court taking up the Affordable Care Act the week after the election and to cast it in that way rather than you know, we're going to get our pound of flesh or you know, I think that would be a terrific mistake. But, you know, this election is just so different from 2016 and so many different layers on it. You know, it's the biggest one being Hillary Clinton's not in it, that Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton, as Amy said, and just not nearly as polarizing as she had been. So I for one try not to bring in the baggage of 2016 because I think that's fighting the last war.
So, Charlie, your observations about this being a referendum on the president are very astute. But do you think that Joe Biden just not being Trump is going to be enough to win the election?
I think Joe Biden not being Hillary Clinton is enough to win the election. I mean, you know, to me, it is a referendum up or down. I don't know that Joe Biden is terribly relevant to this election. Hillary Clinton was extremely relevant. I mean, in 2016, you had a contest that was between the Republican with the highest unfavorable ratings of any Republican nominee in the history of polling up against a Democrat with the highest unfavorable ratings of any Democratic nominee in the history of polling. And one of them was going to win no matter what. And as it turned out, the people that hated both of them voted for Trump by a 19, 20 point margin. And that was like roughly a fifth of the electorate. So I think the not being Hillary, it's not just that Joe Biden is not, you know, Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. I think, to be honest, I think that's sufficient to win because the president's carrying a record and has to defend the status quo at a time when you typically see 72% of the American people think the country is headed in the wrong direction. And that's usually a kiss of death for a party holding the White House.
So let's assume arguendo that Biden does win. You know, his reputation and his style, certainly through his Senate years, was one of bringing together moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, and making deals and moving the ball forward. That dynamic doesn't exist anymore. So when you have progressive Democrats and conservative Republicans in control of those party apparatuses, how is President Biden going to govern?
I can start there and then Charlie can jump in. Look, I do think that the Biden as the center-left president means that or maybe let's rewind a minute. I agree with you that this idea that you're going to get progressive Democrats in the House, conservative Republicans, especially given that many of those Republicans are trying to reform the Republican Party with Trump out of the center of it, right? They're all going to be trying to claim the mantle of the new leader of the Republican Party. That's going to make it really hard to get big things done. At the same time, I do think that there is this window of opportunity for Joe Biden on the coronavirus. The one thing that still does unite the country, which is wanting to get rid of it, wanting to move beyond it, wanting a vaccine, and wanting to get that vaccine delivered in an efficient and safe, whatever way. I think that the beginning of the year, and this will be true even if Trump wins, the beginning of next year is going to be all about, is this vaccine ready and how do we get it out and how does it get to the right people at the right times? That's going to be consuming most of their time, on top of bringing an economy back that has been devastated. State and local governments are going to be coming forward with empty bank accounts. So those things are going to take up and should be taking up the majority of the time and thinking of the White House, and not going into the sort of wish list, checklist. As Charlie pointed out, I love that image of the Thelma and Louise going off the cliff. It's like, let's focus, at least in these first 6 months, on the things we know everybody is concerned about, and start at that point. And soon enough, it will devolve back into tribal warfare. And we can, let that go where it is. The one opportunity that Biden does have, though, to keep his base happy without having to have these legislative wars, is doing a lot through executive action. Remember, a lot of the work that this White House has done in moving policy has been through executive orders. And so that can be undone without having to go through a legislative process. It gives Democrats some things to check off on their list. And again, I think it helps keep the president focused, if it's President Biden, on, as they say, the main thing. Isn't that Haley Barbour? The main thing is the main thing. One other thing to remember, this class of Democrats that came in 2018, Democrats could add to that class in 2020. And the class coming in on the Democratic side on the Senate, they are all in the mold, or almost all, of a more moderate, more Biden-like kind of candidate. These are the folks that determine the majority in the House and the Senate. They are the fulcrum, not the folks on the left. Now, the folks on the left are going to get the most attention, and certainly they have an agenda that's going to get most of the attention. But where the votes are is not with those folks. It's with the ones who sit in suburban Denver. They sit in suburban Dallas and Atlanta. Those are the folks who are also going to be pushing on Biden and pushing on the party to keep it from going way off the Thelma and Louise cliff.
And to just to continue where Amy left off, Joe Biden has plenty of shortcomings, and it's not hard to find major issues that he turned out to be wrong on. So not to pretend that that's not the case, but having watched him for 47 years, like I have, this image that's being cultivated of he's a tool of the radical left and a figurehead for the radical. I mean, to me, it's unrecognizable that that's not the guy I'd watched for 47 years. And I remember that the reason he is the Democratic nominee is that he wasn't Bernie Sanders. He wasn't Elizabeth Warren. The party was like 60% of the party, the least liberal 60% of the party was horrified that Bernie Sanders was about to win the nomination, and all rose up, pushed all the other centrists out, and handed the nomination to Joe Biden, who, a week earlier didn't have two quarters to rub together. It was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen, but that's the reason why he is the nominee. And this does match up, being sort of center left, he's closer to the center of or to the right side of the Democratic Party than to the left side. No, I think that's absolutely the case. But that for what we're going to see, I think is going to happen is if Vice President Biden wins, and if Democrats get a majority in the Senate, I think what you're going to see is a troika here. And you're going to have Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer, and all of them are liberal. But Nancy Pelosi, this is not her first rodeo. She's been around a while. She saw what happened to Democrats in 93, 94. She was speaker when Democrats did their last Thelma and Louise back in 2009 and 10. And Amy will tell you, she knows her as well. Nancy Pelosi, she's got faults, but forgetting something isn't one. She has a really good memory. And so I think you're going to see Pelosi, Schumer, Biden trying to steer a left but not far left agenda, while you've got Warren, Sanders, AOC, the squad coming at them this way. And to Amy's point, where Democrats won their majority in the House was in picking up longtime Republican suburbs outside of Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, Richmond, Virginia, places like that. People with military or intelligence backgrounds. There are a lot more of those than there were members of the squad, but it's the squad that gets on the cover of Time magazine. So, I think there's a little bit of a caricature here, but the tendency, the human nature, and last point, Joe Biden will be turning 78 on November 20th, so 3 weeks after the election. And, I don't think he certainly hasn't said whether he's would run for a second term or not. I can't imagine he's actually made a decision, but my hunch is he probably wouldn't. But the thing about it is, so how would that affect his thinking if elected? You could paint two scenarios. One scenario is, I'm probably not going to be running for reelection, so I don't have to worry about reelection. I don't have to worry about a liberal challenge, a challenge from the left. And so I can basically steer towards where I want to go rather than doing all the tacking back and forth. That's scenario A. Scenario B, I'm probably not going to run for reelection, and thus there isn't going to be a second term. Thus, I better get as much done as I possibly can, as fast as I can, in any way I can, which, by the way, is what new presidents usually do anyway. So which is it? Now, do they follow history or that? And that we'll have to kind of wait and see.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. One quick last question. You're both incredibly good at what you do here, and you've both been at it a long time. So for each of you, what's the single biggest difference you see in this election cycle and ones that you have followed in the past?
I don't know, besides a pandemic. And, I wasn't around. I've been following it a while. I wasn't around in 1918, sadly. No, it's a really good question, because I have to say, of all of the things that had surprised me this cycle, it really was, that moment in February, and Charlie alluded to this, when it looked like not only was Bernie Sanders in the lead, but nobody, the rest of the vote was getting split among all these different candidates. Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Biden, Warren was still hanging on. And, it just sort of looked like this thing was going to end up in just a, just split vote everywhere. And that Buttigieg and Klobuchar and Beto all at the same time, either dropped out or dropped out, and then announced supported Joe Biden, threw their support behind him. That was quite a remarkable thing to see, because politicians are not, how do we put this? They're not usually magnanimous, right? Their goal is to win. They want to win. And what they did there was, even though they knew they didn't have necessarily a chance to win the nomination, they knew that they would be relevant for a long period of time if they stayed in this race, and they kept up the fight, and they were able to get more notoriety. But that they dropped out, and not just dropped out to let Joe Biden have it, but then to endorse him at the last minute. I thought that was pretty remarkable in what has been, a remarkable 4 years.
Peter, I think it'd be easier to say, to try to look, well, a better challenge would be to say, what is there about this year that's similar to any other year you've ever seen? Because, you'd be forced to say, well, it's kind of like this, except this, and that, all kinds of exceptions. But I think so, but to try that, I do think that the one thing that seems to resemble the past is that it's about the incumbent. It's about the record. And if people are happy and want to renew a president's contract, then, it's pretty hard to dissuade them of that. But if people have grave doubts, and I think there was a a real vulnerability that the president had pre-coronavirus and pre-economic downturn, where he was consistently behind, but it was still competitive. He was still in striking distance, and then boom. And that loss of the tailwind that I talked about, and a feeling that, if you take, you take any credible national poll and ask them, you approve or disapprove of the president's job of handling the coronavirus? And just about everyone is going to show an approval rating of between 38 and 42%, and a disapproval rating in the high 50s or touching 60. Now, I don't think, call me old fashioned, but I don't think you could have a large majority of the electorate disapproving of your handling of the biggest crisis the country's faced in 3/4 of a century, this close to an election, and get reelected. I have a hard time seeing that, sort of metaphysically, seeing how that happens, and I don't think it is going to, unless there's some weird black swan event. But I think this is basically going to be a referendum up or down, and the president chose a base strategy to reinforce his base and not to expand. And, that's fine. But if I won fewer votes than the other candidate, I think I would want to try to play addition a little more rather than just holding or contraction. And, I think right now he'd be hard pressed to hit to the 46% that he got last time. And as Amy noted, that, we're not going to have 6% of the vote chewed up by third-party candidates and write-ins. I think it's probably going to be closer to 2 or 3 than normal. So this could turn around. It could, but I'm a little skeptical about whether it happens, and I have no reason to think that the president would have any advantage in a debate over Joe Biden, particularly now that I read that the president's doing very little debate prep. And, his interview with Chris Wallace just went so well 2 months ago, and that's the moderator of the first debate. So,
well, it's going to be fun to get together with you sometime in November, hopefully before Thanksgiving, to compare scorecards. And meanwhile, stay safe and be well.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
And thank you all.
Thanks, Peter.